partners. But without further ado, I want to introduce our speaker this afternoon. Kelsey Hart currently serves as the Training and Care Coordinator for the Rockford Family Peace Center, where her focus is on creating trauma-informed, inclusive, and culturally responsive wellness for survivors and staff. She's trained advocates, social workers, educators, attorneys, judges, and a variety of other professionals on workplace stress and trauma and meaningful self-care practices. Prior to her role at the Family Peace Center, Kelsey worked as a project manager for the 17th Judicial Circuit Court, managing a federal grant focused on improving the criminal justice response to domestic violence. Kelsey holds a master's degree in pastoral and spiritual care from the Iliff School of Theology in Denver, Colorado, and a bachelor's degree in sociology and gender studies from Illinois College in Jacksonville, Illinois. She has 15 years experience working with women and families experiencing domestic violence, homelessness, and other forms of trauma. Now I'd like to turn it over to Kelsey Hart.
Thank you. Thanks, Warren. I really appreciate NAMI making space to kind of the importance of mental health for survivors of domestic violence. So I am going to share my screen and hopefully, and then we'll get going.
Oh, and before we get started, I just want to mention that if people have questions, they could kindly type them into the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. Also, there will be time for question and answers at the end of the session. And just as a reminder, this session is being recorded, and we will stop recording at the Q&A session so that people can free with privacy concerns. Okay, is that okay, Kelsey?
That sounds great. Right. Yep. Thanks, Warren. Okay. All right. So you just heard that. That's me. I'm Kelsey Hart. I work here at the Rockford Family Peace Center. And so that I'm going to talk a little bit about our work at the center at the end of the presentation as well. So just as we get our conversation started, I think it's important to be mindful of what the content is, right? That we are going to talk about domestic violence and abuse and the impact that it can have on our lives. And so just want you to be mindful of how you're feeling and take a break as you need to today. So what are our goals for this training? A couple of things. I want to spend some time talking about the different types of abuse that can occur in intimate partner relationships and the different ways that impacts survivors' mental health. We're going to talk about the ways that abuse impacts survivor safety and the choices and maybe the behaviors that we see. We're going to talk a little bit about what trauma-informed care means and why it's so essential to believe, support, and validate survivors' experiences. And then, as I said, I'll tell you a little bit about our work over here at the Rockford Family Peace Center. So as we start, I think it's really important to say from the top, domestic violence impacts people and relationships across all gender, racial, economic, education levels, religious, and cultural boundaries. What I think the nuance that's important here, right, as we talk about different types of abuse, is that the types of abuse look different and the impact of the abuse can be different based on a person's identity, right? So I'm a middle-class white lady with an advanced degree, right? So I have access to a whole lot more resources potentially and social capital if I were trying to leave an abusive relationship versus a single mother who's working a minimum wage job or two, or right, someone who's in an LGBTQ relationship and they're trying to get access to safety and support. So just being mindful of the disparate impact of the way domestic violence plays out in people's lives. So globally, right, domestic violence impacts people across all those lines. And that same thing is true locally. Statistics from our City of Rockford Police Department demonstrate that DV occurs in every zip code across the city. So that is why it's so important not to make assumptions about who you're interacting with in the course of your work or in the course of your life, right? Statistics tell us that 1 in 4 women and 1 in 7 men will be victims of domestic violence across their lifetime. So survivors exist in every space that you're in. And while studies show that 85 to 95% of survivors of domestic violence are women, it's also important to honor and recognize the fact that men can be survivors of abuse and that abuse occurs in LGBTQ relationships as well. So it's important to honor all those experiences. So for the purposes of our conversation today, right, we want to talk about mental health. And I think it's particularly important to say that folks with serious mental illness are more vulnerable to be a victim of violence. So you're looking there at your screen, just a couple of recent studies that show, for example, 63% of folks with a dating partner reported being physically abused in the previous year, right? So a previous diagnosis of a mental illness is considered one of those risk factors for experiencing domestic violence. Trauma is a word that we say all the time. And I think it's important for the purposes of this conversation, just to sort of ground us in a really good definition of trauma. So you see that on your screen. Trauma is the result of an event, a series of events, or a set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening and has lasting adverse effects, right? So there's sort of 3 parts to that definition. The first one is the event or the circumstances. That's certainly domestic violence is one form of trauma, but you all know, I'm preaching to the choir here, lots of things can be considered trauma in folks' lives. So then that event or set of circumstances is experienced as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening. So that means that we all experience trauma differently. So what I might experience as a trauma, others may not consider so traumatic. And what's important to note about that is it's not a value judgment, right? It doesn't mean that one person is stronger than another. It just means we're all wired differently, and and we all bring different backgrounds to that particular traumatic event. And the third piece of that definition is the impact, that lasting adverse effect, right? So trauma is our body and brain's normal reaction trying to process an abnormal circumstance, and domestic violence is a very specific, pretty insidious form of trauma. Our next definition, again, to just sort of ground our conversation, is what's domestic violence. So today I'm going to talk specifically about intimate partner domestic violence. Certainly abuse can and does occur like between family members and roommates, and that's considered domestic violence under the law. But to put it really in the context of our work at the Family Peace Center, we'll focus on an intimate partner relationship. So when we talk about this, we talk about a pattern of behaviors that's used to gain and maintain power and control over another partner. And I think what's really important to highlight about domestic violence is that it can be uniquely traumatic for survivors. Thinking back to that definition of trauma I just told you about, right? The circumstances are traumatic. So we talk about things like emotional abuse and economic abuse, and I'll tell you more about those types of abuse. So you got traumatic circumstances and oftentimes these very traumatic physical abusive events that occur too. So that really compounds the traumatic experience for survivors. So more than one of these types of abuse is generally taking place in that relationship, and an abusive person is likely to use different strategies and tactics to maintain control over that other person. Research is growing around this term coercive control. So you may often hear intimate partner domestic violence being referred to as coercive control as well. What you're looking at now is what advocates call the power and control wheel. It may be familiar to many of you, and it really displays some of those behaviors most commonly used to exert power and control over another person. Abusive behaviors and tactics take a whole lot of forms, right? And it's definitely not always physical. So I'm going to jump right in now to just kind of taking apart some of those pieces of those different tactics of abuse that a survivor might experience. The first is emotional abuse, right? May be familiar to many of you. Emotional abuse can be very, very insidious, and it's often really hard to recognize. This is behavior like name calling or insults, right? Constantly criticizing somebody, telling somebody they're worthless or you're lucky to have me. When survivors hear this stuff over and over again, you really begin to internalize and believe it. Isolation is another really common tactic of abusive people. It's really about separating a survivor from their friends and loved ones. You see that in that quote on your screen there, right? A survivor has told me many of times, right? He told me none of my friends and my family liked me, and I believed him. What's particularly can be scary about isolation is that it often starts off really flattering. In a new relationship, you spend all your time together, you see your loved ones less and less, that sort of real intensity at the beginning of a relationship. And then before you know it, you're all alone. Many survivors have that experience. Denying, minimizing, and blaming. Denying that the abuse happened, minimizing the impact. Oh, you're being dramatic. It wasn't really that bad. Survivors hear that all the time. And it really plays into the gaslighting, right? Which is a particular tactic used to throw a survivor off balance. We often call it crazy making, to make a survivor question their experience of reality. A colleague of mine shares this story often, who had a survivor had an abuser who was always moving her keys, which seems really innocuous, right? Really a simple thing. But then she'd go look for her keys if it was time to go to work or something. And then the partner would lean into name calling. Oh, you can't keep track of anything. You'd lose your head if it wasn't attached, right? And it's just this very unsettling, unique experience that can really impact a survivor. Make her question herself, right? So that's emotional abuse. The next type of abuse I wanted to talk about is economic abuse. So they're looking there on your screen, there's lots of examples of how this might play out in an abusive relationship. Being inability to work or the opposite of that, right? Overworking. Really, this might be connected to a religious belief sometimes, right? Women should stay home and raise the kids, that sort of thing. Oftentimes weaponizing or misusing traditional gender norms here. But again, you see that focus on the abusive partner wanting to have the power and control over the relationship. They have the say in what that survivor does if they get to work or not, right? Things like controlling how money is spent, denying access to bank accounts, giving somebody an allowance, and then tracking spending, right? I've worked with lots of survivors who have to turn in receipts after they go to store. Really those sorts of things that really strip you of your independence in a lot of ways. Next important type of abuse I want to highlight is sexual coercion and abuse. Again, you see a list of lots of examples there on your screen. But when we talk about sexual coercion and abuse, I think it's worth asking, right? In the context of economic abuse and emotional abuse, somebody is losing power in those other ways. Are you really able to give like free consent to sex in those cases? Most likely not, right? And you see that dynamic in that little quote there on your screen there. If I told my partner I wasn't in the mood for sex, he would keep me up all night and accuse me of cheating. It was easier to just do it and get it over with, right? So sure, like there's just like this element of coercion and lack of consent a lot. So that's just really something to keep in mind when you're working with survivors of domestic violence. And then the obvious one we often think about, right? Physical abuse. This one is, punching, slapping, kicking, those sorts of things. Strangulation is a really serious form of physical abuse that we are just learning more about the impact that has on someone's physical health in lots and lots of ways. I think the other thing that's important to highlight here about physical abuse is that intimidation and threats is very common and very subtle in abusive relationships as well. So you can communicate a lot to somebody without saying a word, right? All an abuser might have to do is look across the room in a certain way, and those things can communicate a lot of fear. Stalking often takes place in abusive relationships, and can just be right one of these tactics. So what we say about stalking is that sort of uninvited contact, whether that's in-person contact, unwanted text messages and phone calls, even unwanted items, right? Again, the sort of seemingly innocuous gifts or flowers that you might look at somebody and say, well, that's really nice. Why would you be upset or scared that someone sent you flowers? Well, in stalking cases, context matters. And so it's really important to ask more questions when those things are happening. And I think the quote on there that really captures this, right, is my partner told me they would tell, if I left, they told me they would tell everyone that I had an STI, right? So they're spreading rumors, invading their life, and again, exerting control over that survivor's life. So what about mental health coercion? There's lots of new research around the ways in which a survivor's mental health can often be weaponized against a survivor as a part of that larger pattern of power and control, right? So a couple of really specific ways this often plays out is preventing a survivor from accessing mental health treatment or having control over a survivor's medication. Again, really, really common things here, but can have a really significant impact on a survivor's well-being. Another common way this plays out can, again, look like care for somebody, right? Maybe they step in and talk to law enforcement or a therapist or a care provider on that survivor's behalf, saying, oh, she's having a hard time right now, like, let me handle this for her, when really it's just taking away that survivor's choice and voice over their own health. It's just another thing to be really mindful of. Here are some stats from a recent survey. The National Center for Domestic Violence, Trauma, and Mental Health is really one of the national leaders around mental health coercion. So if you're interested in this conversation, I really would encourage you to check out their website, and they've got some great resources, right? But a recent study that they conducted showed that 89% of the survivors who called the National Domestic Violence Hotline had experienced at least one type of mental health coercion, right? 89%. That's a huge chunk, obviously, of survivors. And really, I think, highlight survivors can be more vulnerable to abuse and really being taken advantage of. So why do survivors stay? I've told you all of these really kind of painful, difficult things that can happen in abusive relationships. We often look at survivors and say, why don't you just leave, right? And the truth is that survivors do leave when it becomes a viable option. But leaving is not an event, it's a process. And it usually, on average, we say 8 times, usually takes a survivor eight times to try before they actually leave for good. What research shows is that leaving is the most dangerous, most lethal, and most unpredictable time for survivors. Most domestic violence homicides occur after a survivor has attempted to leave. So in providing some context there on the types of abuses that survivors are facing, I hope that you can pause the next time you're tempted to say, well, why don't you just leave? There's lots and lots and lots of reasonable reasons why a survivor might choose to stay, right? For their safety, because of fear, because they're financially dependent on that person, because they've been isolated, right? Because they've been told nobody else cares about them, and they believe that, right? The other reality is that we work with survivors who really love this person, and there's a very real hope and belief that the relationship will change or improve. And abusive people can be very good at this sort of charm and leaning into saying, "I'm sorry, I will never do this again. I'm gonna get help. I'm going to talk to somebody." And when somebody we love says that, we want to believe them, and survivors are no different. I think it's also important to highlight that we often think survivors are going to be safe once the relationship is over. And unfortunately, right, that's often not the case, especially potentially when there's a family involved. And often this doesn't end just the tactic. Oftentimes we see a lot more stalking or physical violence and escalation. So I think that is why it is so important for survivors to receive really ongoing good support and help and assistance from their community. So I'm sure you're wondering, right? All of these experiences, how does this impact a survivor's mental health and well-being? So let's talk a little bit about that, right? So we know domestic violence is a form of trauma. We know trauma has a tremendous impact on our mental health. So I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of symptoms or behaviors you might see that might lead you to wonder if somebody's experiencing domestic violence, because it is likely that you might observe a behavior or hear about some of these signs and symptoms before you ever find out that someone is experiencing abuse. There is still a tremendous amount of stigma in our world around talking about what's happening in their relationship, right? There's a lot of stigma around domestic violence. It still has some shame attached to it. It can be really embarrassing to say, this is what I'm experiencing in my relationship. So a survivor may not disclose that that's what they're experiencing in a relationship, but you, as somebody who cares, can ask more questions. Oh, I'm observing this behavior. Tell me about your relationship. And by being a safe person, you open yourself up to hearing those things and being able to offer really good support. So we know that there's lots of common reactions to trauma. And many survivors have those sort of immediate reactions to trauma that we associate things like hypervigilance and flashbacks and fear, avoidance of something that might be a reminder of the trauma. And oftentimes those resolve without any sort of long-term PTSD or mental health impacts. It's normal for those things after a traumatic event, those symptoms to show up for the first couple weeks. But these symptoms can certainly be more significant for survivors who have a previous trauma history. And I think because we've talked about the compounding nature of domestic violence, right? The circumstances are traumatic, and then they also have those traumatic events. Survivors often find themselves walking on eggshells, trying to prevent the next or a future explosive incident. So in living under those circumstances, it leaves survivors with very little time to process and understand their experiences and find healing and hope. So that's just a lot for survivors to walk around and carry with them while they're trying to navigate potentially safety or leaving. Here's another couple of really important statistics when we talk about mental health impact. On average, more than half of the women seen in mental health settings going to a counselor or a therapist are being or have been abused by an intimate partner. So lots and lots of survivors looking for help and support and healing and recovery. The most common diagnoses for survivors, PTSD, depression, anxiety, and experiencing abuse increases your risk for several things, right? Depression, PTSD, even suicide attempts and substance use. So again, experiencing abuse can really be a really detrimental experience. So what are some other really common reactions to trauma? Beyond the immediate crisis, and even without a diagnosis, right? I'm preaching to the choir here, and we all have mental health. So without that diagnosis, it still impacts our well-being, how we feel about ourselves. So for survivors, that can look like difficulty concentrating. It can look like worrying a lot, maybe over things that seem small to us on the outside. It can mean difficulty making decisions. It can mean disruption in memory, right? I'm certain that many of you know that when we've experienced a trauma, we don't always remember in a linear way, right? Which can make it difficult for survivors to access the help and support that they need, especially from law enforcement or the court, where it is really important to remember things in a linear way. Survivors can experience, difficulty sleeping, eating, these sort of behavioral changes, right? I think another nuance that I want to highlight when we're talking about common reactions to trauma is that there's an emotional and a mental impact, but there's also a physical impact. And scientists are just learning more about the impact of traumatic brain injury. And there's a really great documentary I'd recommend called This Hits Home. So if this is something you're interested in, that's a great thing to check out and learn more about. One particular survivors that can impact their well-being is the loss of agency, right? So in an abusive relationship, somebody else has the power and control. And so agency is the feeling like you have some control over what happens in your life. And when power and control tactics strip survivors of that sense of agency, it sort of robs them of the imagination that something could be different or better. And really what this is a loss of hope in lots of ways. And so I think that's something that is just a nuance that's really important to keep in mind when you're working with somebody who's experienced domestic violence, is that they can feel really paralyzed by making what may, again, seem to us on the outside as a really straightforward, simple decision. When we talk about trauma-informed care, we're going to talk about empowerment. And this very loss of agency is why it's so important to be survivor-centered and to work from an empowerment point of view. So, as I said, in addition to the ways that domestic violence can impact us internally, right, it also impacts behavior. And there are certainly times when survivors behave in ways that appears to run in contradiction to how we think they should act, or what we think their experiences of abuse ought to lead them to act, right? And this is because of the trauma they've experienced. So just to highlight a few, right? A lack of affect is really common because survivors have been in those traumatic circumstances for a while. What they're telling us might sound shocking, and they don't sound shocked by it, right? It's just become normalized. Their reactions don't match the experiences they're describing. Survivors can miss appointments, right? They can become combative sometimes, or just argumentative. And I think it's important to note that if a survivor is becoming argumentative, we tell our staff over here at the Peace Center all the time, it's because they finally feel safe. because you have created a safe space where all of those feelings are welcome and a survivor doesn't feel like they've got to walk on eggshells anymore. So it's important to highlight that. And then, you know, returning, right? Returning back to that abusive person, contacting that abusive person. Like I said, survivors leave 7 to 8 times before they leave for good. And so they are often navigating their safety in ways that we don't even realize. So a text message or a contact with that abuser might seem like something they shouldn't do, but we have to trust that survivors know that abuser best. And we're going to, we at the Family Peace Center certainly want to trust survivors to make those decisions for themselves, right? That's part of that empowerment model. So why does this matter, right? When we talk about trauma-informed care and the ways in which it is so essential to treat survivors with the highest levels of kindness and dignity and respect. I want to share this quote with you. Trauma-informed care recognizes that traumatic experiences terrify, overwhelm, and violate an individual. It requires a commitment to not repeat these experiences and in whatever way possible to restore a sense of safety, power, and self-worth. So what does trauma-informed advocacy look like for us at the Family Peace Center? Generally speaking, trauma-informed care revolves around these 5 categories, right? The first being safety. We cannot guarantee that a survivor is going to be safe in that relationship or when they leave our building, but we know that we've got control over what happens in our space. And so we work really hard to make sure our space feels physically and emotionally safe for everybody in the building. That doesn't mean we get it perfect and right all the time, but that's safety is constantly top of mind for us. Trustworthiness. As you might imagine, it can be really difficult for survivors to start trusting people again outside of that relationship. And what I often say is that we can't make survivors trust us, but we can be trustworthy, right? We can be and do what we say we're going to do, right? We can set clear expectations and be consistent in our boundaries and make sure we are explaining things thoroughly so that a survivor knows what they're going to get when they come in contact with us. Choice is, again, another huge part of being trauma-informed with survivors of domestic violence, because that abuser has taken away all of the choices, right? Sometimes even down to what makeup they get to wear or the clothes they get to put on every morning. So we want to make sure that we are giving the survivors choice and control back in their own lives as much as possible. Collaboration and shared power, right? We are doing things with survivors, not for them. We want to walk alongside survivors. We can't always fix the crisis. Most of the time we can't, right? But we can come alongside them and share hope and just be with them in the hardest moments. And empowerment, right? Recognizing a survivor's strengths, and this can build a really realistic sense of hope. There's a really great research around the cumulative impact of empowerment as you're giving survivors back choice and voice in their lives. So when a survivor makes their own choice, even when it doesn't work out, even when the outcome isn't kind of what they wanted, they remember that that was their choice, and then they can do it again in the future, right? So that's sort of the power of hope and empowerment in action for survivors. Like even in the simplest things, we're always letting survivors make their own choices. This is one of my favorite little cartoons, I think, from the Awkward Yeti. They're so great. But this is such a good visual reminder of all of the things each of us, right? But most specifically survivors are carrying, and how little of it we can actually see, right? So think back to that survivor who might be argumentative about something small, or having a huge reaction to something, right? Like a seemingly, like you see in the cartoon, a minor inconvenience. But what the brain doesn't see is all of those things that sweet little anatomical heart is carrying around with them. And we cannot see those things for survivors. We can't see it, but we've got to trust that they are doing the very best they can under impossible circumstances. And we can lean in to seeing their strengths and showing them that they deserve better, right? If you know Ted Lasso, that's one of my favorite shows in the whole wide world, right? But he says, be curious and not judgmental. And I think it's really, really easy for us to walk around and sit in judgment of survivors, right? Like, why don't they just leave? And I hope instead of sitting in judgment, right, we can say, tell me more about what's going on, right? Really getting curious about why there are so many barriers to safety and support for survivors. So be trauma informed. What are some really practical applications of this? First and foremost, right? We must believe survivors when they tell us their experiences. It's not our jobs to be investigators, unless of course you're law enforcement on the call today. It's not your job to investigate what's happening. It's your job to believe them, to remind them that they are worthy and they don't deserve abuse. You can listen without judgment. Really importantly, don't tell someone what to do or what you think they would do or should do. That often feels like judgment for survivors. You also don't want to make promises. We can't guarantee that leaving is going to be the safest choice, but we can remind survivors that they know their situation best. And we can encourage and support them and tell them we're going to walk alongside them, but we're not going to make promises, right? That, oh, if you call the police, he'll be arrested, or we just can't make those promises. The system is much bigger than an individual, right? We can explain processes as fully as we can and provide those choices whenever possible. Again, giving survivors back a sense of power. It's really important to be mindful of physical space and approach and touch. Always, always, always ask before you touch somebody who's experienced trauma. And again, another one of those things we talk about all the time at the Family Peace Center is that we don't take it personally, right? Survivors are often agitated, might come across as rude or overly emotional. But again, right, that's because they feel safe to do that with us. And it's not because of us. And that can really help, right? Being trauma informed can really help us avoid things like burnout and vicarious trauma, because it's not about us. We don't have to get irritated by the way they talked to us, because they would talk to their abuser that way if they could, if they felt safe, but they felt safe doing it with you because you've built up that trusting relationship. And the Rockford Family Peace Center. Spend just a little bit of time talking about our work because the way we do our work matters just as much as what we do. That's really, I believe that really strongly. That's really important to us, right? So the Family Peace Center is a central location. We are a co-located service model where we have over 37 partner agencies who are working out of one location, either on a full or part-time basis, to increase access to services and to reduce barriers for survivors. We've got, like I said, like about 36 or 37 partners who are working together to make sure that survivors get the help and support and the safety that they need and deserve in our community. So what's the model? We didn't come up with this idea on our own. We are modeled after the Family Justice Center. The first Family Justice Center opened in San Diego, California in 2002. That was led by a couple of former prosecutors who found that it was sometimes very difficult to keep survivors engaged in the criminal process, which can sometimes take a very long time. And it wasn't necessarily because they didn't want to be a part of that process. It was because there were so many barriers to safety and support. And so they found that co-locating services in one place made it a lot easier. And as that has grown over the last 20 or so years, there's been research to demonstrate that it reduces domestic violence homicides and all sorts of other really great outcomes for survivors and for the safety of communities more generally. So family justice centers are an internationally recognized best practice for serving survivors. So because of all the things that I've just told you about the impact of domestic violence and trauma on survivors' mental health, we at the Family Peace Center really take a holistic approach to service delivery. Symptoms of trauma, physical injuries, lack of trust in traditional systems, and that loss of self-esteem and agency can make it really difficult for survivors to navigate safety and healing. So we've got services in one place. In addition to that, we have crisis navigators, and we also got case managers who really come alongside survivors and can help make sure that they are connected to services and can go to court with survivors, file orders of protection as needed, help navigate a sometimes really complicated housing system. All of those things, right? When you're experiencing those myriad of symptoms of trauma, right? Sometimes it can just be really hard to make a phone call. And so to have an advocate alongside you, a case manager who's going to help encourage you, and step in at only when you are asking, only when it's needed, makes a huge difference in terms of engagement and support and safety. One of our partner agencies that we love dearly, Family Counseling Services, has shared with us that they found that the survivors that have gotten contact with their therapists through the Family Peace Center stay engaged much longer than those who come to them directly. So there's just one example of the way that the model is working for survivors in our community. We also have support groups and do a lot of trauma-informed wellness, things like acupuncture and journaling workshops and yoga, because research demonstrates that healing after trauma also happens in relationship, in community. And so we're working really hard to create those safe spaces for survivors. We also have what we call our great space, kind of functions as a center for survivors to come and do homework. We've got some computers so they can fill out job applications, all in a really safe location. We also have an incredible children's advocate. Miss Emily is here for survivors 8 to 5 Monday through Friday. And so if a survivor is in the center, either working on homework, filling out job applications on the computer, or meeting with a therapist or law enforcement, Miss Emily can take care of their children. So that makes a huge difference, right, in reducing barriers and access to safety and support for survivors. Again, here's just a list of many of the services I just mentioned to you. And here's our partners. This is really, like I said, where the magic happens. It makes such a difference in engagement for a survivor to walk through the door and say, hey, I need help with my family case. And we don't just hand them a brochure. We can say, hey, let me walk you down the hall and introduce you to Cindy. She can potentially help get you connected, right? Like that warm handoff really conveys a lot of trust, right? And a lot of other those trauma-informed principles that I mentioned. October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month, right? Just so happens that here I am sitting with all of you doing this presentation. So if you're curious about how you can get involved or help and support the movement to support survivors in our community, there's a couple of ways there on your screen, right? You can wear a purple ribbon. It's very simple, but purple is the color of domestic violence awareness. You can familiarize yourself with the services available to survivors in our community and how to access them. We are lucky to work very closely with Remedies and Rockford Sexual Assault Counseling and other advocacy organizations in our community. So our community does have some great support for survivors. You can post information about domestic violence services at your organization. We've got posters that we're happy to share and bring with you. Then a survivor can discreetly have that information when they're ready to make a phone call. We love doing training. So if you would like a training about domestic violence or about the Family Peace Center for your organization, your church group, anything like that, we're happy to do that. Another great way you can support our work at the Family Peace Center is to request a wish list or host a donation drive. And if you're interested in doing that, I'm happy to provide that information as well. Here's a couple of resources for you, some of which I mentioned while we were talking. Some of them are where my statistics came from. And just really, really thank you for taking the time out of your day to hear about our work over at the Family Peace Center and to demonstrate to the survivors in your community that you care and that they deserve better.